Consuelo Vanderbilt's story is the kind of tale that sounds like it was lifted straight out of a grand period drama. Except in her case, every lavish detail and every heartbreaking twist actually happened. Imagine the scene, the Gilded Age in New York City, where some families swim in money so vast it almost feels like mythology. You have ballrooms dripping in crystal chandeliers, ladies in gowns worth the GDP of small nations, and millionaires frantic to secure their place among Europe's age-old aristocracy. At the center of it all is a young woman, practically still a girl, whose face graced every society column, whose name appeared in endless gossip-laden headlines, and who found herself bartered off like a rare collectible. That young woman was Consuelo Vanderbilt, one of the most celebrated heiresses in American history, and a figure whose life we still find ourselves whispering about more than a century later. In contemplating this whirlwind environment, one must remember that the late 19th century in America was a time of frenetic wealth creation. The Industrial Revolution had catapulted certain entrepreneurial families, like the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Rockefellers, into stratospheric economic positions, creating a new caste of millionaires and centimillionaires who competed for social legitimacy, both at home and abroad. New York City, in particular, was ground zero for these families, with Fifth Avenue mansions standing as monuments to their fortunes. The high society that Consuelo Vanderbilt was born into did not merely revolve around money. It relied on ostentatious displays of wealth, elaborate soirees, and the pursuit of titles and honors that old European lineages guarded so dearly. Imagine newly rich American barons and baronesses, desperately wanting to be seen as the equals, if not the superiors, of ancient nobility. Many heads turned toward Europe, where centuries of aristocratic tradition still reigned, and a select few believed that the best way to gain acceptance into the truly exclusive echelons of high society was to forge marital ties across the Atlantic. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born right into the crossfire of these transatlantic ambitions. Her journey began in 1877, in the epicenter of old money New York. The Vanderbilt family, already famed for their railroads and staggering fortune, was headed by Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, and her formidable mother, Alva. Even from infancy, Consuelo was caught in a tug of war between American wealth and European nobility. You see, in the late 19th century, many American social climbers yearned for something money alone couldn't quite buy, a title. Sure, the Vanderbilts had enough riches to purchase entire neighborhoods, but in the eyes of the European elite, that didn't guarantee them the upper echelons of respect. Alva Vanderbilt, ambitious almost to the point of obsession, decided that her daughter would be the ticket into those closed circles of dukes and duchesses who traced their lineages back centuries. The plan was crystal clear from day one. Consuelo would become the perfect masterpiece, the shining jewel that would let the family slip into the European aristocracy's tight embrace. To fully understand the intensity of Alva Vanderbilt's determination, it is worth exploring the socio-cultural environment of old money New York versus old blood Europe. Even among New York's upper crust, few families carried the kind of ancient pedigree that made European aristocrats take them seriously. Alva's deep-seated insecurities about acceptance propelled her every move. She was fully aware that while the Vanderbilt name was associated with massive wealth, it was not connected to centuries of tradition, heraldry, and feudal legacy. This disparity was the driving force behind Alva's strategic planning for Consuelo's future. Indeed, Alva had already made waves in New York society by orchestrating extravagant balls in mansions that rivaled palatial estates. She had even faced and overcome resistance from the old money Astor family, who initially refused to acknowledge her. Over time, her meticulously orchestrated parties earned her grudging acceptance in the highest social spheres of the United States. But there was always a bigger prize: embedding the Vanderbilt legacy into European aristocratic circles. Consuelo's upbringing was at first glance a whirlwind of opulence and privilege. She lived in mansions that could rival royal palaces, dined off the finest china in New York, spent seasons in Paris where she became fluent in French, and took music lessons to refine her natural talents. But behind that sparkling facade was the relentless push from her mother to shape her into the ideal society bride. Think of it like a child star being groomed for stardom, except instead of Hollywood, the stage was the noble courts of Europe. Every posture, every mannerism, every turn of phrase was scrutinized to ensure Consuelo exuded the grace and charm befitting a duchess. If Consuelo ever entertained the notion of marrying for love, or even daydreamed about living a life guided by her own passions, it was swiftly shut down. The single, all-consuming mission to marry up, or more accurately across the Atlantic, into European nobility, thus conferring upon the Vanderbilts a rightful place among lords and ladies. Adding to the complexity, Consuelo grew up surrounded by the constant clash between her mother's exacting standards and her own private feelings. Reports from that era suggest Alva was a strict disciplinarian who believed in steely resolve rather than maternal tenderness, and Consuelo often found herself bearing the full brunt of that resolve. Her lessons weren't limited to languages and music. She also had to master etiquette, posture, the correct way to interact with dignitaries, and the subtle art of reading a social room. Any slip-up or rebellious inclination on Consuelo's part was met with an intensity that bordered on emotional coercion. These were the invisible shackles she wore long before she would be fitted for her wedding gown. The idea of a loving match was foreign to Alva's worldview. Practicality ruled every decision. Consequently, Consuelo found herself growing up in a gilded cage where pearls, diamonds, and the swirl of social engagements were all meticulously leveraged to craft her into the perfect duchess. It might sound almost comedic now, imagining a mother so determined to buy her way into a system of monarchy and peerage. But the stakes were all too real for Alva, whose vanity and longing to be accepted by the old money class of Europe bordered on fanaticism. She knew that a well-arranged marriage for Consuelo would open doors that even the richest Americans of the time found locked. Titles held real power in the social hierarchy of the day, and Alva wasn't about to let her family remain on the outside. If it required treating her daughter like a commodity, so be it. Consuelo, though gently raised, was ultimately being packaged for export, an American princess to rescue an ancient British estate with newly minted dollars. In the broader context of the Gilded Age, these transatlantic marriages were not uncommon. They were colloquially dubbed cash-for-class arrangements, where wealthy American heiresses married into British or European noble families who were financially strapped yet socially prestigious. The outcome was beneficial, at least on paper, for both sides. The noble family got an infusion of capital to maintain crumbling estates, while the American family gained that all-important aristocratic connection. This phenomenon was so prevalent that it shaped a subculture of matchmaking, with entire social seasons in London dedicated to introducing wealthy Americans to eligible European aristocrats. Consuelo, then, was part of a generation of young American women who found themselves whisked across the ocean in a quest that was less about romance and more about fortifying reputations and estates. And so, in 1895, when Consuelo was just 18 years old, that carefully orchestrated plan reached its crescendo. She was told she must marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He wasn't just any duke either. He was a cousin of Winston Churchill. Yes, that Winston Churchill, who would one day become Prime Minister of Great Britain. But for all his impressive lineage, Charles was also a man with his own agenda. He had an ancestral palace to maintain, Blenheim Palace, a monumental estate that made many royal residences look modest in comparison, and it demanded a deep reservoir of funds to keep its gilded halls shining. It was a simple equation. He had the title, she had the fortune. A match made in aristocratic heaven, more like a polite business arrangement disguised as a wedding. By this point, Alva Vanderbilt's unwavering focus on linking her daughter to an aristocratic lineage had reached fever pitch. Alva had scouted many potential blue-blooded husbands for Consuelo, and Charles Spencer Churchill ticked every box she desired. The Marlborough name was among the most illustrious in Britain, and Blenheim Palace symbolized a grand legacy that spanned centuries. What it lacked was the financial cushion to preserve it in the style to which its inhabitants were accustomed. Across the Atlantic came the Vanderbilt fortune, fresh, immense, and exactly what was needed to keep those ancient walls standing. Consuelo's feelings about the match were secondary, if considered at all. In fact, most accounts suggest she had made her own choice of husband, Winthrop Rutherford, an American socialite. But her mother ruthlessly quashed that romance. Legend has it that Consuelo was so distraught over the forced engagement that she spent her wedding day in tears, her veil unable to conceal the sorrow etched on her face. Alva, in a display of maternal iron will, even threatened to lock Consuelo in her room or stage a suicide attempt if the young woman refused to go through with it. So there was Consuelo, standing at the altar, trembling with a mixture of tears and resignation, wearing a wedding gown valued at a price most people couldn't comprehend. Meanwhile, newspapers championed her as the most radiant bride of the century, the ultimate trophy in a union that sealed the alliance of Vanderbilt wealth with British aristocracy. If ever there was a spectacle that captured the extravagance and the underlying cruelty of the Gilded Age, this was it. To appreciate the full emotional weight of that moment, one must imagine the scene in St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue, the pews filled with curious onlookers and high society figures from both sides of the Atlantic, the choirs singing, the air thick with a sort of electric anticipation. For Consuelo, the entire world was watching her tears. She knew in that single moment that her life was being sealed away in a grand arrangement that benefited everyone but herself. The newspapers, enthralled by her beauty and the fortune attached to her name, offered little sympathy, choosing instead to marvel at the cost of her bridal attire, the splendor of the Vanderbilt family's wealth, and the prestige of the Duke's title. This was a hallmark of Gilded Age reporting, where a young bride's emotional turmoil was overshadowed by the glittering spectacle her wedding symbolized. From the outside, the new Duchess of Marlborough appeared to have it all. Blenheim Palace, her new home, was so vast that stepping inside was like wandering into a fairy tale kingdom. Endless corridors, gardens that stretched beyond the horizon, priceless artworks lining the walls. This was a venue that practically shouted about generations of inherited prestige. You'd find rooms that dwarfed typical houses, hidden chambers full of relics from centuries past, and entire wings staffed by an army of servants. Consuelo was expected to preside over this miniature realm with the poise of a born aristocrat, graciously receiving guests from across Europe, hosting grand banquets, and wearing dazzling diamonds that complemented her slender neck. In photographs of the day, you see her posed elegantly, an ethereal figure with regal bearing. her eyes betraying an unsettling sadness. While it may sound like a dream existence, living in a palace among priceless artifacts, the reality was quite the opposite. Blenheim Palace needed significant upkeep. It was a symbol of British history, but also of the financial strains that came with such a grand property. Consuelo's dowry, effectively, was the lifeline preventing it from spiraling into disrepair. Yet the palace's grandeur also amplified her sense of isolation. Each echo in the labyrinthine hallways served as a haunting reminder of just how far she was from the world and life she might have wanted for herself. The estate's staff, numbering in the dozens, was trained to operate according to the strictest protocols of British aristocracy. They bowed or curtsied. They answered to the newly minted Duchess, but she often felt more like a decorative piece than the true mistress of the house. Behind the regal facade, the marriage was as hollow as an echoing chamber in Blenheim's endless corridors. Charles Spencer Churchill was never in love with her. In fact, he had a mistress long before the wedding vows, and he felt no particular need to hide that fact from Consuelo. As for Consuelo, she had been in love with someone else, a man named Winthrop Rutherford, before her mother's machinations intervened. All of that was brushed aside in the name of duty, or, more accurately, in the name of the perfect deal between two families. Consuelo's chief responsibility now was to produce heirs. She did just that, giving birth to two sons, fulfilling her role in perpetuating the Marlborough lineage and reinforcing the Vanderbilt link to European nobility. Despite the outward show of triumph, loneliness dug its claws into her. Her personal freedoms were curtailed, her emotional needs ignored, and her sense of identity threatened to vanish. Once she had provided what British aristocratic tradition demanded, two heirs, often euphemistically referred to as the heir and the spare, her perceived utility to the Duke dwindled further. While Charles Spencer Churchill busied himself with social events, mistresses, and the upkeep of Blenheim, Consuelo was left to endure the heavy silences and the glances of a staff that, while polite, must have recognized the Duchess's sorrow. She tried to find some sense of purpose, perhaps attempting to mold herself into the role demanded of her. Yet the fundamental emptiness of the marriage was impossible to ignore. It was also an era when a woman's station was perilous. Even with her wealth, Consuelo found herself effectively trapped by social expectations and legal constraints. Divorce was not just frowned upon, it was often considered a social death sentence for a woman, especially one who held a noble title. In those days, the very notion of a duchess seeking a divorce was scandal enough to upend polite society. For the first decade of her marriage, Consuelo endured the austere rules of British aristocratic life. She was carefully monitored by her mother-in-law, Frances, the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough, who saw Consuelo more as an ornament to be polished and displayed. Beyond that, the complicated politics of the Churchill family left little room for Consuelo's independent thought. She may have arrived with a fortune large enough to uplift the entire estate, but she was expected to remain demure and obedient, an American girl playing a scripted role in an old British drama. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were indeed witnessing the first major waves of feminism, particularly in Britain and the United States. Women were pressing for suffrage, challenging property laws, and questioning the social norms that confined them. For a duchess to show even a glimmer of solidarity with these issues was remarkable given how entrenched aristocratic society was in the status quo, but Consuelo, with her American roots and her deeply personal insight into the cost of a transactional marriage, found herself increasingly unable to remain on the sidelines. She read feminist tracts, engaged in hushed conversations about women's rights, and slowly realized that her own predicament was part of a larger systemic issue. When Consuelo finally decided she would no longer remain a silent, decorative figure, she encountered a storm of opposition. Divorce was taboo, a social avalanche that would leave reputations in ruins. For a duchess to pursue it, practically unimaginable. Yet in 1921, Consuelo broke away from tradition and spearheaded one of the earliest high-profile aristocratic divorces to receive legal and even papal recognition. The Roman Catholic Church granted an annulment, a move that rocked upper-class circles on both sides of the Atlantic. It was a demonstration that even the thick walls of aristocratic custom could be cracked by individual will. For Consuelo, that moment was the beginning of a second life, a transformation from sheltered duchess to a liberated, autonomous woman. Her decision was not taken lightly. She must have weighed the potential fallout, becoming persona non grata in some elite circles, possibly strained relations with her own family, and the relentless glare of the tabloid press. The church's involvement also raised eyebrows. Getting a religious annulment was no simple matter, especially for a woman who had been front and center of Anglican and Episcopalian social realms. Yet Consuelo persisted, bolstered by a combination of personal conviction and the weariness of living a life she never truly chose. Perhaps it was also a measure of her moral courage, recognizing that her prominence could serve as an example to other women similarly trapped in hollow marriages. In the aftermath, she left behind the imposing grandeur of Blenheim Palace and married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator, industrialist, and inventor. Their relationship stood in stark contrast to her first. Jacques appreciated Consuelo for who she was, not for her dowry or the status that came with her name. With him, she explored the genuine love that had been denied her in her youth, and she finally felt free to pursue her own interests. Freed from the strictures of a forced marriage, she emerged as an influential philanthropist, channeling her wealth and fame into causes that aimed to elevate those who needed it most. During shed her daughter toward a life of aristocratic misery, only to discover later that women's empowerment was a more fulfilling cause than social climbing. Consuelo, for her part, seems to have maintained a degree of filial respect, but she never shied away from critiquing her mother's role in orchestrating the forced marriage. In many respects, it was Alva's ambition that initially caged Consuelo, yet it might also have been Alva's eventual alignment with women's rights that somewhat softened the sharp edges of their strained relationship. Consuelo's story also resonates strongly in contemporary pop culture. Television series and historical dramas set in the Gilded Age or Edwardian England frequently draw on the trope of the wealthy American heiress marrying into cash-poor aristocracy. Characters in shows like Downton Abbey or The Gilded Age mirror elements of Consuelo's real-life experiences, being welcomed for their fortunes, but never entirely accepted as equals, facing complicated entanglements of duty and love, and forging their own paths amid rigid social hierarchies. While these fictional stories are captivating, Consuelo's actual life arguably surpasses them in both drama and emotional depth. It's also fascinating to consider how Winston Churchill, a relative of Consuelo's first husband, might have viewed her situation. Although there is scant evidence of Winston Churchill's direct involvement in her personal affairs, he was a man known for his keen observations of British society. He might well have recognized the complexities and ironies of an American duchess walking the halls of Blenheim, a place inextricably tied to his own family legacy. Blenheim Palace was, after all, the birthplace of Winston Churchill himself. The presence of an American heiress, with her dowry-fueled contribution to preserving the estate, would not have gone unnoticed in Churchill's orbit, even if the details of her unhappiness remained behind closed doors. Ultimately, Consuelo Vanderbilt's life invites us to scrutinize the ways in which societies, past and present, commodify relationships for status and survival. Hers was a tale that combined wealth, power, sacrifice, and eventually emancipation. It mirrored the highest echelons of aristocratic privilege and revealed how hollow those privileges could be if one's personal freedoms were forfeited. That she managed to escape her original fate and become a philanthropic figure, an author, and an advocate of women's autonomy underscores the inherent power of personal evolution. The gilded carriages, the diamond-studded tiaras, the monumental estates, and indeed these details are enchanting in their own way. But the real story of Consuelo Vanderbilt resides in the interplay of heartbreak, rebellion, and eventual redemption. Her tears at the altar were not the end. They were merely the beginning of a metamorphosis that would eventually help redefine how society viewed the roles and rights of women, at least in some small measure.